Chapter 6. A Legal Tangle. "Why, Mr. Wheeler, I didn't mean—" George broke in. "Please forgive me." The retired lawyer, mollified by George's apology, took a deep breath. "Perhaps I should explain," Nancy said. "We heard that Mrs. Horton had a little grandchild staying with her, but no one in Deep River seems to know anything about her. Your story startled us." Mr. Wheeler finally calmed down. "I will outline the circumstances," he said, seating himself again. "When I was called in, Mrs. Horton was already dead. Only the doctor and the undertaker were there, but they showed me several notes left by her on a bedside table, along with a couple of signed checks. All were in the old woman's handwriting. One said the granddaughter mentioned in her will lived at a certain address in New York City. Another note said she desired a private funeral. A third requested that since Joan's parents were not living, I was to take charge of everything. Accordingly, I notified the granddaughter, who came here with a lawyer and a couple. They were friends. Joan had with her a birth certificate, a copy of the marriage license of her parents, and letters from her grandmother. The identification seemed bona fide." Bess inquired, "The age of the grandchild and a guardian were not mentioned in the will?" "No," Mr. Wheeler answered. "By the way, I did not draw the will. The lawyer who had and the witnesses who had signed it were not living." "Was there a large estate?" Nancy queried. The retired lawyer said there had been very little cash in Mrs. Horton's home safe, but he had found many securities there. "All of them were transferred to Joan," he explained. "After she left the Horton house, I never heard from her again." "Did she sell the property?" George spoke up. "Yes, it was purchased by neighbors, but it has since been sold to other people." "What was the name of the couple who worked for Mrs. Horton just before her death?" Nancy asked. Mr. Wheeler said he did not know. All this time, Nancy had been studying the elderly man's face. It was an enigma to her. Was he completely honest, or was he involved in a crooked deal regarding the will? George asked, "Those notes you were given, could they possibly have been forgeries?" The retired lawyer, instead of becoming angry over the question, looked troubled. "I most certainly hope not," he said. "Did you keep the notes?" Nancy asked. "No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I laid them down at the Horton house and they disappeared. I assumed someone had thrown them away, thinking they were no longer of any use." Nancy stood up. She felt that the girls had gleaned all the information possible from Mr. Wheeler, who appeared genuinely upset. "I'm sorry we disturbed you," said Nancy. "Thank you very much for this information. I'll pass it along to my dad. Probably he will be in touch with you when he returns home." Bess and George said goodbye, but Mr. Wheeler did not rise. He seemed stunned and his thoughts far away. Nancy wished she were a mind reader. Had Mr. Wheeler told all the facts? The girls let themselves out the front door and started for the car. "That was really something, wasn't it?" Bess remarked. "I don't know who was more stunned, Mr. Wheeler or me," said Nancy. "Do you realize what this means, girls? If this whole thing was a grand hoax and someone got away with Mrs. Horton's estate, there's no chance of the real Joanie Hortons getting it, or even of being found. And don't forget," Bess added, "that we haven't learned one single thing about the 3-year-old child named Joanie Horton. It looks as if she never existed." "It sure is a mystery," said George, as the girls climbed into the car. After lunch, they returned to the motel. Nancy went at once to the telephone and tried to call her father. She learned, however, that he had left the San Francisco hotel, but was expected back in a few days. Nancy next called Hannah Gruen. When the housekeeper heard the latest developments in the case, She was alarmed by the news. "There may be more danger in this mystery than you bargained for, Nancy," she said. "If your father should phone, I'll give him your message, and I'm sure he'll get in touch with you." The kindly woman begged Nancy to use extreme caution as she proceeded in her sleuthing. "Don't forget," Nancy reminded her with a chuckle, "that the moonstone I brought is supposed to bring me good luck." "Moonstone, bah," Mrs. Gruen said. "Use your good common sense and you'll be better off." As Nancy said goodbye, Bess came up to her and announced she would like to offer a suggestion. "Don't you think you ought to get in touch with the Bowens and tell them the whole story?" Nancy shook her head. "I'll call them, but I won't tell them what we've learned. It's possible that they may be the phonies. I'm sure I can't imagine what their game would be after all these years, but Dad says never take anything for granted. I think we should try to learn the truth in this case before telling them anything more, but I do want to ask them a question." Nancy put in the call to the couple who were staying in New York City. She told them she had nothing to report, but thought they themselves might get a clue to their missing grandchild through the organization which had sent them to Africa as missionaries. Surely it would have notified Mrs. Horton of their capture. "What was the name of the group?" she asked. Mrs. Bowen said it was the African Brotherhood Society of New York. Unfortunately, the society has been out of existence several years, so there are no contacts in that direction. "That's too bad," said Nancy, who realized it would be very difficult to trace anyone who had been in the organization 15 years before. "Well, I'll say goodbye now. If I learn anything worthwhile, I'll get in touch with you." George joined the other girls, and they discussed the case from every angle. Nancy gave a great sigh. "I think the best thing for me to do right now is clear my brain of the Horton case for a while." Bess giggled. "How do you propose to do that?" "By taking a swim. Shall we get ready to go back to the castle? I'd like to find out if anyone is staying there illegally, and if such a person has anything to do with our case." "Let's go," said George. Bess was silent. Finally, she confessed. "Nancy, while you were telephoning, an absolute dream boy here at the motel asked me to play tennis." She looked off into the distance. "But I'll go with you," she added. Nancy and George began to laugh. "Like fun you will," said George. "You just can't wait to get out on the court with that boy." "You know," said Nancy, "it might not be a bad idea. It might fool any inquisitive people if Bess doesn't act as if she were at Longview just as a detective. You go ahead, Bess, and play tennis. If George and I aren't back in 3 hours, then suppose you and Whoosie Whatsus come after us." Bess blinked and flung up her head. "Okay, but his name's Alan Ryder," she retorted. George sniffed. "Better be sure, dear cuz, that he is not one of the Seaman gang." Bess stamped her foot furiously. "George Fane, there are times when I could pull your hair right out by the roots." She stalked off. Giggling, Nancy and George went to their room. They undressed, put on swimsuits, and over them their shorts and shirts. They rolled towels in waterproof bags which they would carry across the moat. The two girls drove off, excited by the prospect of what they might learn about the old castle. Just before reaching the drawbridge, George began to laugh. "Nancy, maybe you and I are a couple of goofs." "We probably are," Nancy admitted. "But what put that idea into your head?" George explained she had heard that in olden times, some drawbridges were built so they could be controlled from the far side of the moat as well as the inside of the castle. If an unwanted visitor or enemy approached the bridge while it was down, a secret mechanism under the road worked automatically to raise the bridge. Maybe there's hidden machinery on this side. In that case, Maybe nobody was at the castle when we walked toward the bridge. We may have set off the mechanism, and up went the bridge." "I suppose you could be right," Nancy agreed. "But I still think somebody on the inside let down those two great chains on the bridge, and perhaps the same person was responsible for running water into the moat." "Well, the bridge is still up, so we're in for a swim," George announced. Nancy suggested that first they walk along the edge of the moat to see if they could find the source of the water supply. It's probably the river, since the far side of the castle faces it. The girls left their shirts and shorts in the car, then walked around the edge of the moat. They discovered a newly dug trench from Deep River. "Now I'm sure someone intends to keep out all visitors," Nancy remarked. She grinned. "But not two people named George Fane and Nancy Drew." "Where shall we swim across?" George asked. Nancy surveyed the area and decided that a spot a short distance from the drawbridge might be the best place. They walked back. The two girls put their loafers into the waterproof bags, slipped into the water, and quickly swam to the other side. They pulled themselves up from the moat onto a narrow roadway and ran to an opening in the stone-walled enclosure where they thought they could avoid detection while drying off. The place had evidently once been a beautiful garden. There were still pretty flowers among the high weeds and grass. Suddenly, the still air was racked with the sepulchral tones of a man's voice. Slowly but distinctly, he warned, "Swim back! Death awaits you here." End of chapter 6.